All right, so I'm gonna walk you guys through some of the basic settings on your camera that you need to change your background blurriness and your brightness of your video, just the basics that you need to know to shoot something. The 4 categories we're gonna hit are aperture, ISO, frame rate or FPS, and shutter speed. So here we go. The first setting we're gonna hit is aperture, also known as f-stop. Now, if you look at your camera screen, this is gonna be the little number that's preceded by an F. So there's gonna be a little letter F and then a number. For example, like f1.4, f2.8, and then f4, f8, whatever. There's just a bunch of numbers in there. Usually it caps out at around 16. General rule of thumb that I follow, the lower this number is, the better. It's gonna blur out your background and it's gonna brighten your image. It brightens your image by actually opening, there's a hole in your lens. So the smaller your f-stop number, so if I have my f-stops up to 1.4, it's gonna be open like all the way. So this hole in the lens is gonna be open, it's gonna be letting in a bunch of light into the camera to hit the sensor. Your image is gonna be brighter, it's gonna blur the background, it's gonna look great. If you raise that number higher, you're gonna shrink the hole, which is gonna cause less light to enter the camera, so your image is gonna be darker, and you're gonna lose that blurry background. Okay, so for example, I'm at f2.0 right now, and I'm gonna change it all the way up to, we're at f6 right now. So you see everything got darker, stuff in the background is more in focus. You can see like the stuff out the windows is more in focus. I'm just gonna bump that right back up to f2, which is where it was. And here we go. And I like this image a lot better. It's brighter, it's cleaner, background's blurry, I'm in focus, so I kind of pop off the background. So again, f-stop or aperture, just keep that number as low as you can. But there is a downside to keeping the number low, and that's mostly, it has to do with keeping your subject in focus. I won't get into the weeds on it, but basically, if you keep this number low and you're shooting with autofocus on your camera, so you're either shooting in autofocus or manual focus. Autofocus, the camera locks onto your subject, and no matter, like I'm shooting in it right now, no matter where I move, I'm still in focus. But if I were in manual focus, it doesn't track me. So then if I were to like lean forward or lean too far back, then I wouldn't be in focus anymore. So if you're shooting in manual focus, keep an eye on it. Again, keep your f-stop as low as possible. But if your subject is moving in and out of focus a lot and it's distracting, just boost that number up a little bit and that'll help them stay in focus more. All right, moving on to ISO. Now what ISO does is it just adjusts the overall brightness of your image. It's the little number in your screen that's preceded by the letters ISO. ISO, that stands for something. Don't ask me what, because I forgot. But the higher the number, the higher your ISO number, the brighter your image is gonna be, the lower the number, the darker it's gonna be. Now, again, I won't get into the weeds too much on this, but generally you wanna keep this number also as low as possible. The reason being, the sensor in your camera, which is the little electronic square that actually receives the image through your lens, what changing the ISO does is it just boosts or decreases the sensitivity electronically of the sensor. And that is important to know because what happens when you boost up this electronic signal too high is you get a bunch of noise in your image, which is basically, it's like artifacts, it's like graininess, and it just makes your image look dirty and not very professional. So you want to keep this ISO number as low as possible. I generally try to keep it under 1,250. If I have to, I'll go up to like 3,200, but generally I try to keep it 800 or lower just to make sure I don't get all that graininess. All right, now moving on to frames per second or FPS. So video is literally moving pictures. Like if I have a video that's 1 second long and I'm shooting in 24 frames a second, that means that I've captured 24 pictures in that 1 second of video. So FPS is actually pretty straightforward. You can shoot in 24 frames a second, you can shoot in 60 frames a second, 30 frames a second, 120 frames a second, 240 frames a second. Don't worry about any of those numbers. Keep it at 24. That number is gonna look the most natural. It's the closest to what your human eye sees. So like if you wave your hand in front of your face, you're gonna see that there's some blur to it. If you shoot in 24 frames a second, it's gonna simulate that blur and it's just gonna look super natural. If you can't shoot in 24 frames a second on your camera, there's usually an option to shoot in 23.98 or in 25 frames a second. Either one of those will work just as fine. Just try to keep it as close to 24 as you can. Okay, and then the final setting is shutter speed. Shutter speed is more of like a photography thing, but it does affect video too. So I'm gonna address it as high level as I can without getting into the weeds on it. But all you really need to know is that it's the little number on your screen that's in a fraction form. So it's like 1/50, 1/200, 1/1000, 1/24,000, whatever. It's the little fraction. You want the second number of the fraction to be double what your frame rate or FPS is. So if I'm shooting in 24 frames a second, then I want this number to be 1/48 because 48 is double 24. This is called the 180-degree rule. You don't have to follow it. Sometimes if you want to do something more artistic, you can change this and mess around with it, and it can be a specific look. But for normal, natural, just like talking heads or promotional videos, just keep this double your frame rate. Now, most times, again, if we're shooting in 24 frames a second, you want it to be 1/48. But a lot of cameras don't have that 1/48 as an option, but they do have 1/50, and that works totally fine. So it's totally cool to just use 1/50. So now you're probably wondering, okay, that's like 4 different settings. It's a bunch of information. How do I actually use them practically when I sit down to shoot something? Because that took me years to learn and to kind of figure out, okay, I should change this setting before I do this setting and all that stuff. So the first thing that you're gonna wanna do is when you get your camera set up and you have your lighting set up, you're gonna want to first make sure you're shooting in the right frame rate. So make sure you're shooting in 24 frames a second or as close to 24 as your camera will do. Then you're gonna check your shutter speed, make sure that that number is double your frame rate. Again, if we're shooting in 24 like we should be, then you wanna change your shutter speed to be 1/48 or 1/50. Then once I have those settings locked in, because those will not change, then I'll move on to my aperture and my ISO, because these are the 2 settings that we do change. The first thing I do is I address my aperture and I try to lower that number as low as it'll go. Again, letting in as much light as possible into the lens itself, which is the most natural way to get light into the camera and into your image, and also giving that nice blurry background. Then I move on to my ISO and I adjust that. So if my image is too bright, by the time I'm done with my aperture or my f-stop, then I'll try to lower my ISO, which sometimes is all you need to do and sometimes it's not enough. For example, I changed up my angle really quick so I can give you a practical application of this. So you sit down and this is like the first thing you're looking at. I actually threw off the settings on purpose here so that I can show you how to adjust them. This image is too bright. So the background is kind of blurry, which is good, but I think I can make it blurrier. And then it's too bright. My face is blown out. Windows behind me are blown out, which is fine. Those windows can be blown out, but my face should not be. So I'm looking at my settings. My ISO is set to 1600, which is pretty high. And my f-stop is set to 4.5. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lower my f-stop down because I do want that to be lower. It's gonna brighten my image, but that's okay. So I'm gonna lower that down to f2. I'm gonna lower it all the way down to 1.4 because, oh gosh, that's so bright. That's gonna give me a blurry background, but obviously this is just insanely blown out. So I'm gonna hop over now to my ISO and I'm gonna lower that down. So the lowest my camera goes is ISO 200. And that's what it's at right now, but I'm still too blown out. So I've lowered my aperture as low as it'll go, 1.4, to give me a bunch of natural light and a blurry background. And I've also lowered my ISO as low as it'll go, but I'm still too bright. So what I do in this situation is I'm gonna go back to my aperture and I'm gonna raise that f-stop number. So I'm gonna raise that up to 2.0, and there we go. That's a lot better. That works pretty good. I think I'm properly exposed. Background is still blurry because if I were to boost this number too high up, it's gonna get too dark, but then the background, as you can see, is gonna get sharper, and I don't want that. So I'm gonna just keep it at f2.0. So again, what I did there is first I adjusted my aperture. It was too bright, so then I lowered my ISO as low as it'll go. It was still too bright, so then I went back to my aperture and I adjusted that to give me the proper exposure. So there you go. Those are the 4 basic settings for video shooting. Good luck.